Before I give my little introduction, let me just tell you how we think the evening will run, and that is that Dr. Esposito will speak probably for around 45 minutes, then we will open it up to probably about a half hour of Q&A. After that, the bookstore, we expect, will have set up some book tables, and we'll have a couple of Dr. Esposito's 47 books for sale out there, and can continue the conversation informally, and he's also available to sign those books. It's a little feedbacky, sorry. Anyway, I am Dr. Carol Guerrero-Murphy. I'm a professor of English and creative writing, and I'm the liaison for inclusive excellence at Adams State University. I want to welcome you and thank you for your interest in interfaith dialogue, understanding, and religious tolerance. As a teacher, especially of first-year students, I often find that students new to the university are surprised when they learn that they're able to take courses such as the Bible as literature, or composition class that may allow them to write about what they believe, or write research papers about religions, or write arguments about atheism or agnosticism along the lines of C.S. Lewis, Why I'm a Christian, or Bertrand Russell's on atheism, or perhaps they study Muslim poetry. But safe and open conversations about human history, social institutions, and systems of belief are in fact ideally placed on campuses. What better place? Cielo Campus Ministries, the Office for Enrollment Management and Program Development, the Office of Student Activities, the Department for History, Anthropology, Political Science, and the Title V grant for Hispanic Serving Institutions, along with the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, the Anabaptist Fellowship, and Body Tune-Up of Alamosa, have all collaborated to make this event possible this evening, with the intention of continuing the kinds of conversations that we get to initiate tonight with Dr. Esposito. But first I want to very specifically give thanks to Dr. Spaldi for his unwavering support of diversity and inclusion and tolerance on this campus. So Dr. Spaldi.
Good evening. It's great to see folks out here for this very important event. And I want to say, especially to Professor John Esposito, thank you so much. We all know it's hard to get from here to anywhere. It's very hard to get from the East Coast to here, and that is a tribute to your dedication and your concern about this very important topic, and I'm just so proud to have you here. Dr. Esposito is a professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. And we talked a little bit at dinner. We're pretty sure it's the oldest Jesuit institution in the United States. And I also commented as a recovering debate coach that this year at the National Debate Tournament, the team from Georgetown soundly whipped the team from University of Michigan. So we're going to kind of celebrate that victory together. Dr. Esposito has served as a consultant to the U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments and corporations. He's a former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies, vice chair of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. He is currently vice president and president-elect of the American Academy of Religion and a member of the European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization. He's also an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations. As was mentioned, he's the author of 47 books. We heard at dinner that there are 2 more in the works. And so for all of you who are trying to read, as many books as you can before you pass from this earth. There's now going to be 49 before you can catch up on one too. That's certainly one of my occupations on my retirement at the end of next year. He's had interviews and articles by various world publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, The Guardian, the Times of London, CNN, ABC, Nightline, CBS, NBC, and BBC. Conspicuously absent, of course, is Fox News. Oh, good for you. So, without further ado, I'm very, very honored to present Dr. John Esposito.
I'm going to speak a little autobiographically at the beginning of this talk.
Oh, okay, there we go. All right, great. I'm going to speak a little autobiographically because some people sort of wonder who I am, given what I do. First of all, I'm an academic, and that's what I do. But in terms of my own sort of history, I'm Italian-American, born and raised in Brooklyn, was in a monastery for 10 years. Next year we'll be married 50 years. To the nun that left to marry me. No, it's not true. In fact, I often say she was pregnant and we had to get married. But anyway, I hope this isn't being taped. But anyway, that's sort of part of my background, and I was trained then after that as a Catholic theologian, and during the time of Vatican II, I was teaching theology for many years, and I only came to study world religions by accident because it was a requirement in the doctoral program that I went into. I intended to do a PhD in Catholic studies, and I became enamored with Hinduism and Zen Buddhism. Then it was recommended that I study Islam, and I was very reluctant to do that because I was in my early 30s, married, and wanted to finish a degree. And also it was after the 1967 war, and I had not read the book, because my mother used to say, of the three boys in the family, I was the roughest one with books because I needed to see a lot of pictures. So I actually had seen the movie, The Exodus, but not read the book. And the portrayal of Arabs in that book was pretty bad. I thought it was historically accurate. So I actually came into the field with a lot of ignorance and a lot of stereotypes. But the interesting thing is that 40 years later, 50 years later, I can say that that's still an issue. I'm amazed at, the way I like to put it is that I'm asked the same questions. The only difference between today and 40 or 50 years ago is now I get paid for it. I mean, that's just the reality. So let me begin with a couple of observations as background to my talk. Number one, Islam is the second largest of the world's religions. 1.6 billion Muslims. So you have more Muslims than you do, for example, Roman Catholics. There are about 2.2 billion Christians totally in the world. Muslim countries are stretched from North Africa to Southeast Asia, some 57 countries. And unlike when I began to study Islam, when Islam was invisible in Europe and America, today it's the second or third largest religion in Europe and America. So we're talking about a world religion of the class of Christianity, okay? A world religion that is global. Now this is important by way of comparison. For example, we talk about a Judeo-Christian tradition, or I talk about a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But if you look at Judaism, there are only 14 million, perhaps 18 million Jews in the entire world. So the numbers are different, the level of globalization is different. Now Hinduism and Buddhism have larger numbers, but they're still nowhere near as global as Christianity and Islam are. Okay, so that's by way of background. The reality of it is, though, that for many Americans, their engagement with Islam came with the Iranian Revolution. So, for example, Tom Brokaw used to be the person who did the Good Morning, not Good Morning America, he did the NBC morning show.
Today.
Right, the Today Show. And during the Iranian Revolution, he began one morning, he interrupted his introduction because we were concerned about the hostages, and he said, let me tell you something about the religion of Islam. And basically what he said was they have a revelation called the Quran and a prophet named Muhammad. Now, this is pretty incredible. And in America, that saw itself as being among the most educated countries in the world, we're rushing to prove that we're not. But in any case, in that America, and dealing with the second largest of the world's religions, the idea that you felt that you needed to say that much, something that basic, for most of us in this room, if we were traveling in other parts of the world, we'd be stunned that nobody had ever heard of Jesus, or that they hadn't heard the phrase Bible or New Testament, okay? So that was part of that background. In the America that I grew up in, Islam was invisible. It wasn't that we didn't have Muslims, but the interesting thing is that the earliest mosques were in places that nobody would normally go to, Iowa and Quincy, Mass. The so-called Boston Mosque was actually in Quincy. Believe me, I taught in New England for 22 years. I didn't know how to get to Quincy until I brought my class there. You know, we knew where Boston was, but not Quincy. So we didn't have mosques, we didn't have centers. Much as we didn't have today, what we have today, Hindu and Buddhist temples. All of this is important in terms of the engagement with the religion. So when we engage this religion, we engaged it in terms of hostage taking. See? And the problem with that is when you don't know anything about a people or a religion, the tendency is your narrow experience is what you generalize from. We do this with ethnic groups. If you don't know an ethnic group and you meet 3 people from an ethnic group, chances are, if they have a kind of robust attitude, you'll conclude that that's the way they all are. You know, I was telling somebody that in my family, here's the board at the time. Yeah, I usually do. Masood, are you here? Where are you? Did you order breakfast? Because this goes on. We don't know when this. But in my family, a mixed marriage at my dad's level was marrying a non-Italian. Okay? So, as I said to somebody earlier, all of the children married Italians, except for my Uncle George, who married my Aunt Kitty. And my Uncle George was a terrific man, as was my Aunt Kitty, a terrific woman. But they both liked to drink. Okay? Now, the fact that I had Tanqueray on the rocks, I think, before I came here, I guess I like to drink too. The Jesuits introduced me to alcohol, but I won't go down that road right now. But it is true. But my Uncle George liked to drink and my Aunt Kitty liked to drink. But the difference was my Uncle George was a man, number one. And if my Uncle George drank too much, he was a man. Okay? Aunt Kitty, if she drank, it meant my grandmother said, see what they're like? The Irish, they drink beer. They drink lots of beer, you know? When I met my wife, and I brought her home to meet my parents, my wife is blonde, blue eyes, incredibly bright, multitasking woman. And I remember when she walked away from me and I saw her, I thought, that's the woman I want. I knew I could see her brain, as well as a lot of other things as she was walking away. And so I brought her home, but suddenly I picked her up, and she was in this black dress, which is what Italians wear when you're in mourning. And I mean, she had black dresses, but with red and purple, but this was plain. She had her hair like tied in the back, very conservatively, very low makeup. And after it, I said to her, you know, were you comfortable? She said, yeah. I said, well, why did you dress this way? She said, well, you know, the only Italians I know are our next door neighbors. And she said, you know, they're nice people, but they're very loud and they're crude. So I immediately explained to her that they obviously were Irish, they couldn't be Italian. My people do operas. We don't, you know, we're not like that. But, you know, we do that with ethnic groups. There are all kinds of generalizations. There are generalizations about, for example, I fulfilled one. I will talk with my hands all the time. My father never did that. My father was Neapolitan, never did that. So we have those kinds of things. And the same thing can happen with regard to religions. We generalize from the few that we see. If you've never met Catholics and then you read about the pedophilia problem for the last 20, 25 years, you might say, wow, would I want my kid to go to a Catholic boys' high school? I don't think so. I mean, it's you know, people talk about they don't want a mosque in their neighborhood, and the example I often give is, oh good, so if the Catholics are going to open a high school in my neighborhood, I'll say, geez, you know, you're too close physically. I mean, giving you people, we don't want to send our young people there. Well, we know that for Catholics and for lots of other people, they will look and say, this is a scourge, but that's not what mainstream religion's about. You know, when Christian identity movements commit violence in America, when Serbs killed 8,000 Muslims in Srebrenica just in one city, let alone all the other thousands they killed, often supported by their Orthodox Christian pastors, and displaced 22 to 28,000 Bosniaks, we didn't say that's Christianity. What we say is they're extremists, okay? So now I'll get to the heartland of what I want to talk about. 9/11 and the war against global terrorism, terrorist attacks in Europe, America, and in the Muslim world, led many, one could say some, but no, many, to charge and to wonder whether or not this wasn't, the problem wasn't Islam. Not some Muslim extremists, but Islam. Not extremists, 3/4 of whom were Saudis, and simply say, well, is it Saudis? You know, or Saudis plus some others, but Islam. Today, there is a well-funded, thriving Islamophobia network, and I'll talk about that after. Islamophobia meaning people who are anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. Not people who have just criticisms based on facts about a religion or its followers. That's perfectly legitimate. But where one is basically saying the religion is the problem. Okay? And I'll come back to this in a second. But the fact is that this issue in modern history, it goes back centuries, but I'm talking about modern history, actually existed before 9/11. From the 1980s and 1990s, you had, in America and Europe, certainly in the media, stories with titles like, this is newspapers, Jihad in America, Islamic Terror, Global Suicide Squad, Don't Look for Moderates in the Islamist Revolution, Holy War Heads Our Way, Prince Charles is wrong, Islam is a menace to the West. Okay. Prominent academics like Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington came out with the thesis that there is a centuries-long clash of civilizations. American media political commentators like Charles Krauthammer, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Harvard Medical School graduate, psychiatrist. Charles sometimes ought to see one, but that's another question. Warns of a global international intifada, uprising. Patrick Buchanan, Georgetown graduate. Sister was among the first students that I ever taught at Rosemont College, a Catholic college. I would get invitations from David Eisenhower welcoming me to the Young Republicans, and I'd go apoplectic in class and say, because she dropped it up there and I didn't know she brought it up, I think, I don't know David Eisenhower. I'm a lifelong Democrat. What do you mean I'm a Young Republican? Anyway, Patrick Buchanan wrote a piece called Rising Islam May Overwhelm the West, in which he warned of a demographic threat, a population threat in the West. That while radical Muslims were humiliating us overseas, in Germany, Turkish doctors would labor late into the night, performing abortions on, quote, German women, meaning Turks couldn't be Germans, no matter how long they lived there, okay? Because, as he said, in the West, where condom is king. So what he's really saying is, and this is what Germans struggle with now, and then Europeans, having become so secular, and have we also limited our families so much and legitimated things like abortion so much that now we're dying out in terms of Christianity. And so what he basically said is these Turkish doctors who have 6 and 8 children are supporting themselves by performing these abortions on German people. And so now there's going to be a demographic threat. There's going to be this, which by the way, this keeps coming up, but if you look at hard studies, this is also not empirically verifiable, but just mentioned that. Then we had the impact of 9/11. Al-Qaeda, obviously. Al-Qaeda calling for a war against America, calling for attacks in Europe. Al-Qaeda, a small but deadly group, but a group that was deadly enough to make them be blown out of proportion in terms of even the threat. Now, and I hope you won't find this offensive, 9/11 was an incredible tragedy. But the reason why it was such a tragedy for us was that we had never been attacked. 3,000 people is horrendous, but we've had in history hundreds of thousands and millions of people killed in Cambodia, killed in etc. But for us, this was an incredible experience, which of course then has a multiplier effect in terms of the group, because the group did do what we would have considered impossible. The idea that you could have people come over and in this kind of just a small group of terrorists with a couple of planes take out the World Trade Center and hit the Pentagon was beyond belief. So what was the reaction right after 9/11? David Cole of Georgetown Law School, one of the top human rights experts in the country, wrote a book called Less Safe, Less Free, which looked at the Bush years. Less Safe, Less Free. It's a terrific read. Now, I come from a family where there were 3 boys, I'm the eldest. And my mother used to say that, and I'm the least intelligent, that's not being humble. If you talk about like, SATs and GREs, I don't even know the numbers. I looked at them and decided to forget them. Okay? And my mother described the 3 of us, we had a read in the summertime. You know Prince Spaghetti, where you get called up by your mother? No, where we lived, it was you got called up because you suddenly got hot water and you could take a bath, or you came up to read. And she'd say, well, the good thing about John, but it was difficult, was he would come up to read, but he was the one that I had to find books with lots of pictures. Lots of pictures. So if I tell you that David's book is a great read, I mean it's a great read. Not only for the stats, he really writes well. Okay. Here's what he says. Right after 9/11, in the follow-up to 9/11, 5,000 foreign nationals were put in preventive detention. No charges, simply rounded up to be looked at and grilled. The U.S. also sought out 8,000 Arab and Muslim men for FBI interviews, and called in 80,000 Arab and Muslim foreign nationals for special registration, fingerprinting, and photographing. This is after 9/11. Remember, this is done by what, 19 people did this attack. Horrendous, but this is the response. Okay? So the response is to simply round people up without any need to show due cause for what you're doing. The idea was that we might find a terrorist. The government's record was 0. Not one of these men, at the time Cole wrote his book, were convicted of a terrorist act. This is not to say that we haven't had terrorist acts in the US, but it's to put into perspective the attack, the response to the attack, and then the overreaction to the attack. And when you do this groundswell of arrests, what does your average American think? We had a problem with the mafia in America. Imagine if you were rounding up tens of thousands of Italian Americans, not just going after specific mafia bosses, etc. What would that signal? Look at what we did with the Japanese. Okay? So this is just by way of background in terms of Americans who know nothing about Islam. Suddenly they're looking at Iran and they see people demonstrating every day yelling death to America. So the natural conclusion is every day at 4 o'clock the bell rings and everybody in Iran runs out into the street and yells death to America. Rather than this is a massive demonstration. that takes place. And yes, people are angry, but this is a group of people that are angry. I can tell you, as somebody who was one of the first people to go into Iran after the revolution, I had no problem as an American. No problem at all. I did not have a body search. I had questions about why are you here, what are you doing here? Okay. The situation gets ratcheted up with media coverage. Remember that for media, as top media people will tell you, if it bleeds, it leads. Okay? That's what sells newspapers. That's what attracts audiences. When you put the news on, it's going to be the gripping stories. In fact, you notice the lead up to news always does this routine of the most gripping. They're going to tell you about the most gripping, stories around. Or the poor weather people have to, of course, come on and say, well, we're going to look at the possibilities of, because most of the time they don't have enough really bad weather to do it. But we know that what sells newspapers and what sells TV, the reason why people look at certain shows is because you're looking for what makes news. What makes news is not the good people in the world and the nice things that are going on. If you call up and say, why don't you come and film my family at Christmas time? We have a lovely family. That's not going to work. It's got to be, come and watch the food fight in our family at Christmas time. Maybe we'll even generate a show out of this. Okay? So, when we look at the media winds up therefore naturally moving in the following direction. Let me cite a study. Now, I should tell you that I tend to do these notes and then I just go off. So, this is going to be brilliant, I can guarantee that. I've never missed. If you see a dove flying over, really embarrassing. I went through security, and so I always have to pull out my chain. I have a chain with the Holy Spirit on it. My wife gave it to me when we were married. It was on our honeymoon. I've never said this in public, so it shows you that I feel safe here. So it's my honeymoon, and it's at night, and the lights are out, and I feel her hands on my head. And I keep feeling this. I'm wondering, I knew something was supposed to happen on honeymoon night, but I didn't think it started there. I couldn't figure out what the hell it was, and then I feel this thing tight. I have a big head, she's trying to get this metal over my head. So it's the Holy Spirit, okay, I'm Catholic. I go through security, and the guy says to me, he says, you seem to know, because I pull it out immediately. He said, so what is this? What's this bird? What kind of bird is this? Okay, that's all right. A week before, the guy said to me, my dad used to have one of these, a picture of it in his wallet. He didn't know what the heck it was, but it showed you it was there. Okay, all right. So, let me give you an idea of the role of the media. 2001, a study of media coverage in 2001 and 2011 of media coverage of Muslims in the Muslim world. Okay? But it's looking at all of media and then saying, what's the coverage of Islam or Muslims like out of all of this coverage, okay? The study looked at 975,000 pieces of media from mainstream newspapers and TV. 975,000 from European and American media. The outfit is called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, and you can probably find it on their website. 975,000. 2001, when you looked at all the media coverage, 2% was of Islamic extremism or Islamic terrorism, okay? 0.1% was on mainstream Muslims, mainstream Islam. So you have almost no context, and then what you are covering, the majority of what you're covering, are the extremists in the group. It's like looking at the Catholic Church and saying, I'm going to show you all these clippings on pedophilia, but we're not going to talk about what the rest is, okay? Jump to 2011. The 2% jumps to 28%. 2% jumps to 28%, okay? Mainstream media remains exactly the same, 0.1%. Now think about the level of distortion. 28%, 0.1%. If you don't have a context, how do you understand the vast majority of people? If I tell you that an American doctor psychiatrist, emigrated to Israel, walked into a mosque in Hebron on Friday, and shot to death Muslims who were praying and wounded many of them. Would we immediately say, there go those Jews again? It's part and parcel of Judaism. Let's go look at their scriptures. Let's go take a look. Oh, look at what Joshua and David did. That must be the way they all are. No, we know immediately. And Israelis would say to you, this isn't representative. And Jews would say to you, this isn't representative. So part of it is, I want to give this to you because you'll see how it plugs into what I want to say a little bit later. So instead of dealing with the extremists and the terrorists and focusing just on them, what gets brushstroked are the majority of Muslims and their religion. And that remains in the popular mind. Then what you see developing in America, both domestically and internationally, in the last 5 to 8 years, is what we call Islamophobia. Now, in Europe, Islamophobia has been used since the late 1990s. Let me give you some examples. Growing up in America, as I did, if you were dealing about discrimination against black people, and that's the way they were called then, or African Americans, as some would want to be called today. Okay, in the old days, discrimination existed. In New York, you could have a sign, as my father used to say, no blacks, no Jews, no Italians. You just put it up, no problem. You could have the discrimination that we had throughout, not just in the South. Some of it was very bitter in the North. Less of the symbolism, but the hatred was very strong. But when we put the word racism on it and came to see that as a no-no and a bad word, to be called a racist now when you say something, and or for media to be charged as being racist, wow. Same thing with regard to discrimination and hate crimes against Jews. When we got to the point where we had a word that we could put on it, called anti-Semitism, and that was recognized that this was a no-no, okay? With regard to discrimination against Islam and Muslims, nothing happened until roughly 2010, where we began to use a word. In Britain in the late 1990s, they called it Islamophobia. One can argue about terms, but what was realized was one needed a term to say that discrimination against somebody because of their religion or because of the color of their skin, which makes them look like they belong to a religion, they're brown, they're dark-skinned, etc. Not because of what they've done, but because of their religion or because there's an association with that religion, where there's discrimination, bias, and hate crimes, that is not acceptable. The first time that got used was with the so-called mosque at Ground Zero, the Park 51 situation, which was not a mosque and which was not a Ground Zero, but hey, why should we worry about facts? But in any case, for the first time, Time magazine had on its cover, "Is America Islamophobic?" And I suggest you go back and read that article. Time had a reporter who went out and investigated it. And his conclusion, you can draw it for yourself, but I will tell you, pretty much winds up being, yes, we have a problem, okay? But that was the first time. But what did we see happen at that time? Inexplicably, a center that was going to be built and was being modeled on the Jewish Center in New York, where I've spoken. They had a major, major center. It's like a many-floor building that does cultural stuff, does religious stuff, does political stuff, brings in the community. It's not just for Jews, etc. Okay, they were going to build something down there along the same lines. That was approved throughout the year by all of the New York people that had to sign off and approve on it. It had been out there for about 2 years with no problem. And then an outside group of people came in, people like Robert Spencer, Pam Geller, who I will say are card-carrying Islamophobes. They run organizations like Jihad in America, Islamization of America, etc. They came in with others and mobilized. And in particular, they used social media. And I'll come back to that later. Social media, because our popular culture today is formed not by newspapers, not even by major television. as significant as Fox or CNN will be. It's by social media. When social media goes viral on something, then our newspapers pick up on it often. It actually sends a signal, this is a big story, because of the way social media can operate, that it can go viral in a way that, a newspaper piece just doesn't go viral. What do we see occur? Not only the mass demonstrations, not only the fact that, yes, people could be upset about it, families who had lost their kids, or spouses, many of them were upset about anything being built near there in that area. Others were not. But the fact is, you had people who were saying, no, this is wrong because this is a monument to terrorism. To have a mosque means that the mosque is a monument to terrorism. To have a church means that the church is a monument to pedophilia. I mean, that kind of logic, okay? And what you saw was then a tsunami of attacks against mosques across the country, from New York to California. As well as those who attempted to block mosques, you had attacks against mosques. You had a mosque in Tennessee that had existed there for years, and suddenly you had people saying, we have to go in there, probably hiding guns. We had objecting in that community in Tennessee to the fact that a man who had lived there for decades, a Muslim, was buried in a local cemetery. And that they had a police escort, which was common in that town. But suddenly it became for that kind of person. And the other phenomenon that we got is the most incredible phenomenon. We now have 29 to 30 states in the United States that have attempted to pass anti-Sharia laws. Now this is fascinating, because the question is, who in any of those states attempted to introduce anti-Sharia laws? No. Oklahoma was the first state. 76% in a referendum of people voted for that. Why? Because Newt Gingrich told them. Why? Because Michelle Bachmann told them. Why? Because Rick Santorum told them. I mean, this is just a fact. I mean, people don't even know what Sharia is. In states where there was no group of Muslims that came forward and said, we want to introduce Sharia law, we somehow want to, have it. What happened was Newt Gingrich made statements like, if he were elected, the first thing he would do is have a federal law to prevent Sharia from being introduced. Newt Gingrich said that building this center in New York was the equivalent of Nazis wanting to demonstrate outside the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's the level of rhetoric. So we have 29 or 30 states. My own state of Florida is engaged in this a number of times. I'm doing a book for Oxford called What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia. It's a Q&A. And I often tell audiences I'm going to dedicate it to the Trinity. Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and Michelle Bachmann. Simply because I think it'd be nice if they knew what Sharia was, so that they know what they're objecting to. But we had both of those phenomena. And what we ran into were reporters at CNN and New York Times saying to me, what's going on? Where did all of this hate come from? And one having to explain, this is the tip of the iceberg. If you actually looked at the internet, if you looked at the websites on the internet, if you looked at the, as we now say in academia, the discourse. In Brooklyn, we didn't use a word like discourse. We used four-letter words to describe what we wanted to talk about. I'm thinking of love, but because I'm out here, I'm sure you're thinking of other words. But the reality of it is that suddenly we have the unveiling of what is a very deep phenomenon in our society. How do we know this? Let me give you some statistics. And let me give you some quotes. Right after 9/11, what does Ann Coulter say? We should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. Imagine if a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or a Buddhist got up and said the reverse. Just change the religion on this one. Michael Savage, his mother named him so well. I think these people, Arabs and Muslims, need to be forcibly converted to Christianity. It's the only thing that can probably turn them into human beings. Daniel Pipes, the Muslim population in this country is not like any other group. It includes within it a substantial body of people many times more numerous than the agents of Osama bin Laden. If that's true, then how come he didn't turn in the names? Why weren't all these people arrested? Pipes is also somebody that has said that 80% of the mosques in America are radical, for example. Never proof, never, etc. They share with the suicide hijackers a hatred of the United States and a desire to transform it into a nation living under the strictures of militant Islam. He also said of Muslims in Europe, you know, a lot of foreign groups come with different attitudes and foods, but this is a particularly different kind of group, Muslims. Now remember, Muslims can be, in America we have Muslims from 68 different countries, all kinds of different cultures. Somehow they become monolithic. And he in fact said their food smells unlike other foods. Their bodies smell like other people. I mean, this is a guy with a PhD from the University of Chicago, okay, who runs a major center. How about politics? President Obama. He ran in 2008, 2012. Was Islam an issue? Bet it was. When he ran in 2008 and was in Dearborn, his people didn't want him to be photographed with young people who had a couple of women who merely had a kerchief on their head, a hijab, a headscarf. To this day, the President of the United States has not visited nor been photographed near a mosque in the United States. Can you imagine any president who never reached out to be a president of the United States, to the Catholic Church, to Judaism, to Protestantism? There'd be a hue and cry. He has been to mosques in Turkey and in Egypt. Think about it. When he went back to Indonesia, he didn't go to his school. And some of his old classmates were waiting to see him. Why? Because people like Daniel Pipes were saying, you know that school he went to when he was a kid? He went to a Muslim school. It was a madrasa. Lest there be fallout. This is the President of the United States. 2012. Virtually every one of the Republican candidates made Islam an issue, either during the elections or within the 2 years before. Herman Cain talked about the fact that he wondered whether or not a Muslim could be a loyal American, and therefore whether or not one could be in his cabinet or hold a position in the government. Gingrich, Santorum, Bachmann all raised the issue of Islam and Muslims. No, I'm not saying raise the issue of Muslim extremism, but equated in the way that they raised it, Muslim extremists with the mainstream religion. So, let's then take a look at some facts. How significant is this Islamophobic or Islamophobia networking threat? Two studies have been done in the last 5 years. One by the Center for American Progress, which is a NGO of a kind of, I'd say, probably liberal democratic background, roughly in background, and one by CARE, which is a Muslim organization. Both these studies are based on IRS returns. So it's not that somebody's just making statements. It's looking at IRS returns. And it really is fun. I just had one of my staff do this for somebody. It's really fun when you see somebody and you realize that they are bigoted and racist, and you can actually go and look at IRS returns and see where they got their money from, what they spent their money on, how much money they're now making doing this as opposed to what they did before. Suddenly somebody's making close to $600,000. Suddenly they have a budget of $7.2 million to spew out some of this hate. Center for American Progress found that 7 major philanthropies, whether the philanthropies knew it or not, because they give to a lot of different outfits, 7 major American philanthropies over a 10-year period gave $42.5 million to websites and to individuals that engage in anti-Islam and anti-Muslim rhetoric. The kinds of outfits that Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist, you remember, who killed all of those people, who in his manifesto, he cited many of these people, some of them 112 times, approvingly, their negative stuff. He attacked, by the way, me and my center on page 97 or 93 for the opposite reason. So that was nice. Again, I'm not a reader. Somebody had to point that out to me. Somebody came along and said, "Did you read the manifesto?" I said, "I haven't. I scanned it, but I didn't read it," okay? All right. CARE did a study of 3 years and found $119 million given to these kinds of organizations and groups. And they run websites that not just have names like Jihad Watch, which you would figure, you know, or there are a lot of other titles, but they have titles like Family Security. That sounds good. American Thinker. Sounds good. But it is a rhetoric that, again, is not simply critical of extremists or critical of aspects of a religion, but in fact, a rhetoric that says, no, the religion is a problem. And therefore, the implication is anybody who's devout and follows that religion, if they're not an extremist, they're prone to be an extremist. In other words, they're programmed to be one. So let's take a look then at that impact. In studies done by Gallup and Pew, and this is the great thing about some of the studies we have now, unlike years ago where I could talk or somebody who disagreed with me could talk, and then the question is, who do I believe? They both have PhDs, they're both whatever, you know? We have data where we actually talk to people. So it's not just me telling you what Muslims believe or me telling you what non-Muslims in America believe. 57% of Americans, when asked what they most admire about Muslim societies, said nothing or I don't know. 57%. Think about some of these stats in reverse if you felt that people were saying this about you, about us. Okay? 33% disclosed that they believe that Muslim Americans are more sympathetic to terrorists. 60% polled said they have negative feelings about Muslims. 19% said they have very strong negative and biased attitudes. Twice what they have towards any other religion. 22% said they didn't want a Muslim as a neighbor. 49% believe U.S. Muslims are not loyal to the U.S. 44% said the good news is Muslims are devout, but the bad news is they're extremists because they are devout because of their religious beliefs. More than 4 out of 10 Americans admit that they have prejudice. 43% said that twice, and that's twice the feelings of prejudice, twice that they have towards Christians and Jews. Significant numbers, 40% believe that Muslims should have special IDs, all Muslims. How does that conclusion match up with data that we have on American Muslims? Go to Pew's website or Gallup's website, you'll find this data. What we know today, unlike 30 or 40 years ago, is that like most other religions who come here or ethnic groups, after 30, 40, 50 years, people begin to become part of the mosaic. So today, Muslims are integrated educationally, economically, and increasingly politically. What does that mean? Educationally, Muslims are second to American Jews in terms of religious communities and education. Second to American Jews. They're among the most educated. 40% have college degrees versus 29% of Americans overall. 40% versus 29%. Muslim women are statistically as educated as Muslim men with college and post-grad degrees and make as much money. The average Muslim makes as much, if not more, as the average non-Muslim in America. They span the socioeconomic spectrum. Doctors, lawyers, NGO leaders, cab drivers. I had a Pakistani driver. He said to me, you know, Professor, he said, people say that we Pakistanis have a problem with women, you know, in terms of our treatment. He said, well, some of them may. He said, but certainly many of us don't. He said, let me give you my own example. He said, he's in the States like he drives 9 months of the year, then he goes home. He said, so my wife's in Pakistan, you know, etc. And, you know, she's got servants, because I send money back, and servants don't cost money. She's got a nice lifestyle. She keeps wanting to come here, and I keep saying it's going to be a different lifestyle. You're going to live in a small apartment, you're not going to. He said, so she comes here. She's driving me crazy. He said, I'm a liberated man. I tell her every morning, go out, get a job, get out of the house, get a job. That was his idea of, you know, liberation. He said, I wanted to get a job. I don't want to keep her home. All right, so we've got a cross-section. One of the largest, most effective groups in America for the last 20 years are the Pakistani physicians. Largest percentage probably of Muslims are in fact physicians in America, as well as lawyers and engineers. It's a very traditional approach. You become a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. You may want your son to be devout, but God forbid he says, I'm dropping out of UCLA medical school to do a PhD in Islamic studies. Then he becomes, mashallah. Stay in medical school, hire an imam to teach you Islam and the Quran, but don't give up medical school. Okay. 31% of Muslims are full-time students, compared to 10% in the general population. 31% compared to 10%. And there is an incredible youth bulge. 59% of adult Muslims are between the ages of 18 and 39. 59%. The number of senior Muslims, really seniors, is so low that you can't do data on them. You don't have a representational set. Regarding religion, unlike many Muslims overseas, 77% of Muslims surveyed say they worship the same God as Christians and Jews. 84% said Muslims should strongly emphasize their shared values. Thomas Jefferson said, an educated citizenry, my favorite colleague. He calls me a cocktail time when I'm lecturing. I love him. He's the only one who calls me that. It's either that or my wife. And I know my wife isn't calling me that. She knows I'm speaking. Thomas Jefferson said an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. That is our challenge today. Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. Muslims in America and Europe are a rapidly growing religion. They are part of the mosaic of their societies. They are second, third, and even fourth generation. All groups that have come here, some of you young people don't realize this. We have an image of America which has to do with our ideals. The fact is that almost every new group that's come here has dealt with discrimination. I remember somebody was writing about Muslims in the New York Times, and they said, well, you know, we don't treat everybody that way. And an Italian-American educator wrote in and said, like hell you don't. Because it was like this rosy thing. You know, when the ethnic Catholics came, we didn't have this problem. That's not true. It's not true. You go back and take a look. There were all kinds of problems. All kinds of problems with discrimination. Ethnic Catholics, when we were appreciated, what were we good for? What are Italians good for? Manual labor. Construction. We work in cement. We run construction companies. We build patios. And we put people in cement. That was, when I first went to Holy Cross, I had a colleague, we had a Jesuit. We have lunch every 2 or 3 years. He'd say, so how are your children? I'd say, I told you, my wife and I don't have children. How's your garden? I'd look at him, he'd say, you know, my garden? He'd say, you know, the zucchini. And the eggplant, I swear to God. I said to him, well, I did build a patio. He smiled. I said, gotcha. No, I don't do patios and I don't do people. Now that's changed a lot because in the last 20 years you've had Italian Americans who've been president of Yale, president of major corporations. When I was a graduate student, the idea wasn't that I would go to a Yale or a Harvard. It was just seen as almost, it was exceptional that Catholics or Jews years and years ago would go to Ivy League schools. They'd be the rare person that went. Muslims face the same issues as other groups. The difference is, what ratchets it up, is what's happened. Just as when the Japanese came, they could have been just like other ethnic groups, but because there was a World War II and Japanese were involved, we wound up putting all of these people in a camp. And so our challenge in a pluralistic America and in a pluralistic society is to realize that all members of the mosaic have to be represented. Because our risk as a country, if you look at the erosion of civil liberties in America, and that erosion exists, I invite you to look at and to study the use of some good laws that we've passed, but their use abusively, and what that's meant in terms of arrest, detention, and conviction in the United States. The risk we face is that we will wake up and realize that the America that we knew, its principles and values, doesn't exist anymore. We saw hints of it with the war on global terrorism, when we suddenly had lawyers saying, you know, this is a new world we live in, global terrorism. That means maybe we revisit torture. Or just war theory, that was for the old days. In this kind of war today, maybe we don't talk about just war. Think about the fact that when we had the invasion of Iraq, the leaders of almost all of the mainstream religious traditions said it's an unjust war. But you have another group of Christian leaders that supported that war. The Pat Robertsons, the Franklin Grahams, etc. Okay. But that shows you both the pluralism, which is good, but the inherent dangers that can be there when we wind up saying that maybe we're going to change the principles and values and say that because of this new kind of threat, then maybe we do special things. I was talking to a very elite corporate group, and I mentioned what happened to the Japanese, at which point one of the corporate people said, and it worked. I said, excuse me? He said, we rounded them up and it worked. So why shouldn't we do it again with Muslims? Now, a lot of his colleagues disagree with him, but the point is, we can say that. And what I would leave you with is this. The next time you see a statement about Islam and Muslims, not just extremists, take out the word Islam and put in another religion. And take out the word Muslim and put in another religion, or put in African American, and think about whether or not that story would have been published, and think about how most people would react to that kind of rhetoric. You can say almost anything you want today. You can say, as I've seen people say, I've seen it on cars, kill them all and let Allah decide. Burn their mosques, etc. Okay? So this is an issue that we face, and it's an issue that deals with religious pluralism. I mean, I talk about this, and I want to emphasize this because I say it to Muslims. I talk about this because I happen to believe in America. If this were happening to Hindus, I'd say it with regard to Hindus. If this were happening to an ethnic group, I mean, that's what we're about. Many of us come from groups that have made it. The last thing we want to do is now be the group that says, forget it. After 9/11, I remember seeing a gas station, front page of the New York Times, and it basically sent them all back where they came from, right? And what's the name? It's an Italian-American name. Again, I'm sure it was an Irish family who borrowed our name because they were in an Italian neighborhood. But I couldn't believe it. I mean, you're thinking it's Italian-American. The guy's probably at best second generation. And here he is. It's like he's a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. You know, we've been here 600 years. You know, this is our country. So, for me, the reason why I come out and I give these talks in this kind of situation is because I believe that we are at an important tipping point. I believe that what always made me feel that no matter where I went, I could come back and feel there's no country like America. I believe we have to be sure that that's the case for our fellow citizens and that they're not discriminated against because they just happen to belong to a particular religion. And I've seen those cases, and I've studied those cases. Thank you. Let me point out a comparison to Bill Clinton. I was with Bill Clinton in a program. This is not a Bill Clinton story. I don't run with Bill Clinton, etc. I probably am wrong. He drinks bottles of this size, like 2, right? In a 2-hour period. It's physically impossible to do that. That's all I want to say. Why don't we go to the Q&A?
All right, so.
And please feel free to disagree with me, Because I voted for Barry Goldwater, even though I'm a lifelong Democrat. Remember what he said? Deep in my heart, I know I'm right.
All right, and I'm just going to help call on people, that's all. So do we have questions for Dr. Esposito or comments? Yes, sir.
Well, I guess as the first question, I'd like to first thank you for coming here. But I was wondering, I hope my question's not too broad, but after it seems like every attack, 9/11, the 2005 attacks in London, etc., it's always brought up whether or not Islam is a religion of peace, and often it's discussed in terms of the other Abrahamic religions, and so I was wondering if you might get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a sort of, if you look at the body count of, historically, in terms of religious wars, what we would call religious wars historically, it's a draw, if not Christianity wins hands down. But if you look at scriptures, it gets really interesting. What I do with my students, and in fact, I get a lot of emails, but if you're interested and you email me, I send you excerpts from the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, and the Quran that deal with warfare. And I give them out of context, and I ask them what conclusions they would draw about these people in this religion. I can tell you that far, far more passages in the Old Testament, in the Bible, which Christians accept, far, far more deal with warfare than in the Quran, number one. Number two, it's only in the Bible, with all the major religious, where you actually have God calling for genocide. Basically saying, destroy all the men, women, and children. So warfare is part of, religion has a dark side and a transcendent side. For those of us that are believers, how many of us are? Let's raise our hands now. I love doing that at Georgetown. I mean, I do it as a joke, and you can see kids just panic. And I say, no, I don't want your hands up. No. I want to know premarital sex, yes, but not religion. No. Religion is too sensitive to talk. The reality of it is that if we're raised in a faith, we know that our faith is about a transcendent reality, or an experience, okay, in all faiths. And that religion helps us transcend ourselves, to be better people. But what we block out is that religion has always had a dark side. Now, what super devout believers will do is deny the dark side. You see, they'll just say, it's not part of my religion at all. Well, it may not be what your religion teaches, but you do have people in your faith that do it. So, for example, Christians love to point to the New Testament, right? But they accept the Old Testament, okay? With Joshua, David. I have people say to me all the time, Muhammad could have been a prophet. He was also a warrior. What do you think Joshua and David were? David not only was a warrior, but he slept with, I don't have to tell you the whole story, okay? I'm sure a lot of you don't know the whole story, but you ought to know it anyway. Okay, all right. But what Christians block out, in addition to that, is the violence comes after that period. When Christianity became part of the empire under Constantine and post that, then you had things like the Inquisition, the Crusades, you know, in other words, and even in the name of just war theory, it became a way to legitimate the idea that you could be a good Christian and also fight. So, when you're looking at religions, all religions have that side. Some have it more than others, but all have that side. And let me just say one other thing. Many of you may watch a TV or a YouTube, and you'll hear them quote something like, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, okay? You go and look at that Quranic quote and look at the passage just before, and look at the sentences after it. And they modulate that statement, okay? That statement refers to a time when the Muslims were under attack by the Meccans. They were not under attack by Christians and Jews at that time, number one. But the bin Ladens of the world use that passage, as do hardline Christians, saying it has to do with Christians and Jews. But more importantly, the passage before and the passage after it basically say that you have a right to defend yourself. But once people stop attacking you, you have to remember that God is compassionate and merciful, and you have to stop fighting. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that Muslim rulers, like Christian rulers, did not use religion to legitimate their wars of expansion. You see, you know what I mean? And cite Pope Urban, when he called for the crusade, said, "God wills it." No, it's sealed. Okay. All right, we can move on. I'm spastic.
Another question? Comment?
You're gonna have to raise your voice because you're in the back.
Yeah, do you see any kind of similar radicalism occurring in other Western countries, like in Europe per se, or Canada?
One of the things I would tell you is, all of you, go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, look at their last study on extremism and radicalism. They're not dealing with the Muslim threat, they're dealing with domestic terrorist groups in America. Many of them are our own homegrown, and many of them are associated with Christian identity groups. But by Christian identity, I mean a certain kind of Christian identity, okay? Or read Terror in the Mind of God, which looks at all religions, by Juergensmeyer. I think that with global terror, with terrorism today, the new forms of terrorism. In other words, we don't have symmetric warfare. We have asymmetric warfare today. You don't need to have a large army to win. All you need are 2 people, 6 people, 12 people, you know. With that phenomenon, we're going to be dealing with this all the time. And we see this in our own country. Look at the attacks that are taking place in public schools. You know what I mean? I mean, the kinds of stuff that's going on now. And you look at the backgrounds. Now, you know, if you were living in another country, like if we were looking at a Muslim country, we'd say, oh, look at these Muslim teenagers. You know, they're terrorists. Look at them in the schools. Look what they're doing. Now, if you were traveling in Pakistan and a Muslim said to you, hey, I'm seeing all this stuff going on, you know, what's going on? You got all these Christian kids who are killing people. It's a total, you know, we're in a situation now where that kind of violence, I think, is with us permanently. And the more our societies become stressed out, the more we're going to see. We're going to see, as we've seen, people walk into their company and shoot up the place. You know, we're going to see that happening, and we're going to see people doing it in the name of religion. You know, we've seen it with abortion clinic bombing. We saw it, as I said, in Bosnia, etc. You see, what brings religion into it is religion makes it even better. If I tell you to do something, even though I am charismatic, I'm probably the most impressive person you've ever met, and you'll never forget me. And you won't be able to sleep tonight. You'll be thinking, God, I wish you were here more often. But the reality of it is, no matter what I say, imagine if I can say, God wants it. You see, once you introduce God into the equation to legitimate or to mobilize people, this gets you beyond the individual. And you see that when you watch your TV stations. You know, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. You watch them raising money sometimes, and they're not raising money for themselves and their over-made-up life and their over-made-up look, etc. You know, it's because it's for God. And the reason why they have that $2 million house, and people write about the fact that they drive this, you know, etc. I mean, so religion has that ability to be both this wonderful movement in life and in creation, but it also has the ability to be distorted, just as democracy does.
Hi. So you said that if I understood you correctly, that the birth rate at which they have children wasn't fully enough to account for the exponential rate in which Muslims grow, the belief action. The thought that goes to my head is...
No, we confused you. I was talking about people's concern in Europe at times. In terms of the exponential growth, or the large growth of Muslims like the large growth of Christians at times, it has to do with size of family. It has to do with converts. I mean, those are the kinds of factors that come in. But in many Muslim countries today, you still have more traditional societies where people have large families. So, you know, it's a bit like, who was I reading about? Pope John the 23rd? Who was canonized. Good. My Roman Catholic background is fading. He was canonized. He was one of 14 children. Your average Italian family today, your average Italian American would be much smaller. But your numbers are much larger. The reason why Christian Catholicism grows today is not because of Europe and America. It's because Catholicism is thriving in places like Africa and still, to a certain extent, in Latin America, where people have large families.
My thought was mainly towards the converts to Islam. There's a saying that you don't really have something to live for until you find something to die for. Do you think that has something to do with
No.
that idea?
You mean to really die? To really die? If somebody becomes a convert to Christianity, it's because they find something to die for. It's because they find something to live for. Now, they may feel that it also helps them when they think about dying in terms of where they're going to go. At least they think that's where they're going to go. Because it all depends on who you're talking to and what faith. The other faith is convinced that they're not going to go there. No, I don't think so. I mean, there are all kinds of converts, but I mean, your mainstream, I've been taught by converts to Catholicism and converts to Islam. I mean, or known converts to Islam, or to other religions. Most people, it's that they find meaning in a religion. You know, that they find the meaning there that they didn't find anyplace else. But not that it's, that they're looking to die for something. I mean, you know, most people aren't, they may plug it in the sense that it gives meaning to my life, and therefore would give meaning to death. You know, but not that they're anxious to die.
Well, not so much that they were anxious to die, but rather that it was worth dying for, belief.
I don't even think that most people really think that. I mean, I think that they would probably, if you said to them, you know, would you, I don't even know if that's the case. When I taught at Holy Cross, I was asked to debate a major in the military who did ROTC, and I thought, this was right around the time when the Marines were attacked, were slaughtered in Lebanon. I mean, hundreds of Marines. And so I thought, oh my God, you know, what's this conversation going to be like? This guy begins his talk. First thing he says to the students, many of them are ROTC, he said, well, first of all, you wouldn't understand any of this because most of you, really, even if you go into the military, aren't willing to die for your country. It's not part of your agenda to really die for anything you believe in. I think there is a certain part of that in America. I mean, you know, it's not like years ago when people, I mean, we have a problem even in sectors of our military. You know, we want to be professional military people. Many of them went in, but never expected the kind of wars that we had, and they'd actually have to face it. So I don't think that the average person today is sort of looking, you know, to die. I mean, I wonder how many of you here ever, I mean, how many of you here ever think seriously about the fact that A, you might have to die for your faith, and how many of you would say, oh, I'd be willing to do it? I think many of us would like to say, I might be willing to do it, but, you know, I was raised to believe that if somebody asked you, you had to say the truth, you know, and die for your faith. I no longer believe that. Not just for myself, I just think that that's kind of silly. But that was something that existed years ago. You know, somebody comes up and they're persecuting, Christians, and they say, you know, are you a Christian? You have to. So I don't think that's it. I think people convert, and particularly when people convert, some people are desperate, but a lot of people convert from strong positions, and people who are very bright. And when they make that conversion, it's a big thing, because for many of them, they're going to lose their family. You know, they're going to be disowned, their families. So it's got to be a real, that this really resonates with them, that it says something to them, that no other faith said for them. Yusuf Islam, the former Cat Stevens, you ask him about, you know, why he became, you know, a Muslim. And you ask a lot of other people, I know a lot of converts. But I'm sure there may be people who are like that, but don't date or marry one. Okay. Yeah, why don't we go here, and you had.
So I guess I would say, as a non-religious person, thinking about...
I could tell that before you even said anything.
Yeah. Just thinking about the value of this experiment that we have that includes pluralism, but really also includes the secular government. I would say that I'm someone who's not interested in seeing one nation under God and our pledge of allegiance or, you know, God we trust on our money supply, or creationism taught in science class. How does this interface with what you're talking about, with the sense that religion might give us some sense of meaning, but that it also has this dangerous side?
Well, it has as much of a dangerous side as your position does. I.e., we live in a pluralistic society, and so then part of what I think our founding fathers wanted to create, and again, it's interesting how we have a debate about this today, but our notion of separation of church and state is to protect both belief and non-belief, you know, and to keep that out of, but we don't say you can't mix religion and politics. We just say institutionally. But the fact is that's really not what exists. Look at the vetting for the Supreme Court. When the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and his colleague were both vetted, okay, major people supported them. For me as an Italian American, the idea that an Italian would ever be on the Supreme Court, or a Catholic, okay, was like incredible. So when Scalia got on, I had a problem. I don't agree with his politics, you know, etc. His son was going to Holy Cross, Scalia went to Georgetown, but this is enormous pride. The idea that I would see hardline Christians, hardline Protestants, dancing in the aisles, trying to get 2 Catholics more on. So now you have more Catholics on the Supreme Court than before. Shows you how much religion has become part of even, and politicized our institutional side. So I would have your concerns about that. But the fact that somebody's a believer doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to want to have their religion be interventionist. On the other hand, I am controversial enough to say that in some countries, if the overwhelming people belong to a particular faith and they want to design their constitution in resonance with that faith, as long as they can make it also work with equality of citizenship, you know, and freedoms, then that's their right. You know, if the majority of people are Buddhist and they want to say that the state religion is Buddhism, but that will not work against citizenship, etc. You know, I think there are multiple models.
As a member of the local media, I appreciate you being here and thank Adams State College, my good neighbor Masood, everyone that made this possible. Expanding more to a worldwide view, I'm curious what your feelings are about what Putin and his regime is up to in Russia, and what that relationship is to the expansion of Muslims in Russia.
I think that, you know, the Putin situation is really interesting. I did years ago, I was invited to the island of Crete. This is like something from a B movie. And I go and I discover there are these international bankers who meet every year. They are mostly European and from the Arab world and from Greece and a few other countries. But there was somebody from Russia, and it was before Putin, it was a predecessor of Putin. But the guy in his presentation got so carried away, so he's doing this Russia open, but he got so carried away that before you know it, he began to talk about the restoration of Mother Russia. You know, he didn't quite use those words, but we all looked at each other stunned because he got so carried. And if you see Putin's logic here, but this goes way back. Look at Chechnya. You have a problem with terrorism in Chechnya. No, you have a prior problem of Russian terrorism. The Chechens drove the Russians out. They were humiliating the Russians, okay? When there then was a violent episode, that became the pretext for Putin to go in and to crush and occupy Russia. He then attempted the same thing with Georgia. He's doing it with Crimea. He may want to extend it. I think that's a major issue. And I think that there can be problems vis-a-vis some of the Muslim areas of Russia. Crimea is a problem because you have the Tatars. And they actually originally came from there. And a good deal of the problem in Crimea is that, as happens when you have imperialism, you move Russian populations into these areas. That's why Russia can now do this. In a number of areas of Eastern Europe, or of the former Soviet Union, of Central Asian republics, you had to move in large numbers of Russians, and so now they say we're going in to liberate our people. Part of the reason you have a problem in the western provinces of China, in the Muslim areas, is because they moved in mainland Chinese, who were not Muslim, put them in privileged positions over the last 30 or 40 years, and then you create, but then you have this reassertion. And I think that that's what Putin's attempting to do. And the international community is caught there. But let me tie this into an example that relates to my talk. Okay? How many people have been killed in Crimea? How many people have been killed so far in the Ukraine? How many people have been imprisoned and tortured? Okay? On the other hand, we've had a coup in Egypt with the president, which our president didn't recognize as a coup. A democratically elected person. Nobody waited to see him turned out of office. Military-led coup. We've had a coup in which at least 3,000 to 6,000 people were slaughtered. Slaughtered. This is international human rights groups, in which 12,000 to 16,000 people have been rounded up and arrested. In which today there was a trial of 700 plus who were condemned to death. There were 529 condemned 3 weeks ago. In trials in which there was no defense allowed. No defense lawyer could speak, no defense. They met for a half hour each day. The judge met for a half hour, and then sentenced all of these people to death. How does that match up against Crimea? It pales in significance. What's the Obama administration said about that? So, I think Putin is on a move. I think it's a serious issue, but I think that I'm concerned about other areas, like what's going on in Egypt right now, which is horrendous. And a Tony Blair who's been making statements that are beyond belief. Beyond belief. Even people in the EU that I know, there's a piece today about referring to his dementia in a speech that he just gave. I mean, we're talking about, again, you know, we're talking about real situations. So, yeah, I think Putin's dangerous, but how dangerous, the international community is going to have to figure out how to deal with that. And it's going to be difficult. He's leveraged well because he's got oil. You know, I mean, he's got oil. So, I mean, that's, you know, but I think, again, we have to learn how to deal with oil producers, whether it's Putin or it's some of the Gulf states. It's really not people. Look, when Christianity was founded, people called it a cult. And we do that when new religions develop. You know, I remember once being on a plane with a Mormon, and you know, we were talking, we had a great conversation. After I kept thinking, my God, you know, he believes that about his scripture and his prophet. And I suddenly realized that having been raised as a Christian, even though I'm a historian of religion, when you study religions traditionally, they all do the same thing. You know, Jews sort of stop it. You know, here's your scripture. You know what I mean? In terms of scriptures. And then Christians do the New Testament. You know, and then anything beyond that, there can be no more books. There can be no more real formal prophets. You know, and Muslims extend that, and then they set it up. Well, you know, what looks like a cult can become a religion. And what makes for religion is, among other things, it's a set of beliefs. And it's a set of beliefs which usually deal with some kind of transcendent reality. You know, it doesn't have to be a personal God. In Buddhism, it can be the experience of nirvana. You know, and in Hinduism, it can be a number of things. But often, new religions are called cults. And then if they get their roots, then they become a religion. Mormonism was rejected by most Christian groups and by many others for a long time. It's become a little bit more mainstream now. Not only because others have recognized them, but because Mormons have spun their story differently in the last 10, 15 years. I'm not saying they did anything bad. I'm just saying, having gone to their temples and seen their videos, they more and more began to emphasize that they're part of Christianity, rather than the uniqueness, simply the uniqueness of, you know, of the Mormon message. You know, religion's in the eye of the beholder too, like beauty.
So, 2 more questions?
Let's do 3 on Catholic, the Trinitarian. Okay. Masood, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
But we will stick around too.
I wanted to ask you about the persecution of Christians. my country, in Pakistan, there are issues going on which are adverse to the Christian and to Christianity. In Saudi Arabia, we hear that Christians are not allowed, they can't carry Bibles and so on. In Sudan, in Nigeria, and so forth.
Yeah, it varies from country to country. I'm familiar with Pakistan, Sudan, more and more familiar with Nigeria. I'm going to be doing a program with Christian and Muslim religious and political leaders there in a couple of weeks. In the last few years in particular, it's not that there haven't been problems in the past, excuse me, but in the last few years there's been an uptick in this situation. In Pakistan, it's part of a broader general problem in Pakistan. Pakistan's gone, as you know, wild. So you have Sunni and Shia militant groups killing each other. You have nationalist groups killing Sunni and Shia and vice versa. And then you've got a Christian minority that is there and has militant groups that also attack it. Once you get into real militant religious groups, whether they are Christian or Muslim or Jewish, they tend to buy into an exclusivist religious worldview. I'm not only right, I'm absolutely right. And so if I'm right, you're wrong. And if I'm going to heaven, you're going to hell. And if I'm following God's mandate, it's God's mandate. I give the example this way. Let's say Christians at Adams State decide to become more Christian. Well, if you're a hardcore Christian, you will immediately say that things have to change overnight. First of all, the Ten Commandments are there. Other people will come along and say, well, given our society, let's do 1 through 6 now, and do the others a little bit later. You know, we've had big storms. Most of our students, if you really say quickly to them what's the difference between fornication and adultery, they can't tell you. Or at least they kind of look at you like, what's wrong with fornication? You know, because they're dealing with, whatever, etc. I mean, we've got such, right? But a real believer will say, if these are God's commandments, this has to be done and imposed now. Once you say that, it has to be done and imposed now. So that's why hardcore Christians, for example, almost 50% of American Christians believe that our laws should be based on the Bible. Now, with that belief, if they're also hardcore, they're going to be people who are going to be saying, we'll do everything that we can, even within separation, to get that implemented. You see, we can't go soft on that. That's when you have a problem. That's when you have a problem. The problem is to move religious traditions. Both Christianity and Islam, for example, historically have believed in religious exclusivism. They had the final revelation. For Christians, they superseded Judaism, and they have a world mission to spread the word. For Muslims, superseded Judaism and Christianity. Christianity had no problem superseding Judaism. Christianity had a problem that anybody thought that they could be superseded. So, you can't play by my example. My example is because I've got the right covenant, okay? All right, so then you had Muslims also saying the same thing. And that's why there was a lot of tension. When you look historically, why was there a lot of tension between Christians and Jews historically? Not only because they were contiguous, but because it was a theological challenge in those days. Each was saying they were the one true faith with a mandate. In today's world, we have to have a religious pluralism in which people can affirm that their faith is the best possible faith for them, but not deny that there can be truth in other faiths. They don't have to say that there can be a fullness of truth, but you can't function, because you can't function in that world as a human being. Politically, you can't. You can't be a Republican or a Democrat and say, all of what I believe in is true, and therefore all of what you believe in is wrong. You can't do it with any ideology or religion. Until we do that, that'll be an issue. And what we've seen is an uptick in places like Malaysia, where we see more of a problem, where Catholics are told you cannot use the word Allah, which is interesting because many of your hardcore Christians here say Allah is not our God. So that's why Muslims don't worship the same God. Well, guess what? Christians in a number of countries, in the Arab world, in Malaysia, use the word Allah because it's part of the indigenous religious language. You know, that's the word that's used. But now you've got in Malaysia an attempt to ban that, etc. And you've had some sporadic attacks. This is an issue. And one cannot underestimate that. At the same time, spend some time looking at hate crimes, violence, injury, even killings that have occurred in Europe and America when it comes to Muslims and Sikhs. Often Sikhs being killed because people think they're Muslim, showing just how religiously illiterate our society is. If it has a beard and a turban, you know, when in fact a Sikh turban is nothing like any turban that a Muslim would wear, okay? But we have that problem with the dark side of religion. But a lot of that goes back to the natures of our society. I believe in America we've become much more shout television, shout media, far more adversarial. We like to see shows where people go at each other. You know, the Sean Hannitys made his tribe decrease. The Ed O'Reillys, etc. I mean, we like that kind of combat. The problem with that combat is that it is combat. Once we're in combat and we're in public, things can only get worse. They can't get better. Okay, we've got to take two. I'll take two questions at the same time and then answer them. Speaking out of both sides of my mouth, which I also can do. Okay, let's take here and yes. And where's the second one? We already know. We got one here. Okay, we got a live one here. Okay, yeah.
My question has to do with what happens after things come to a head. Let's say the Muslim Center in New York or the mosque in Tennessee. Do those things tend to fester or do they burn out? Does healing start to happen after that?
It depends on the part of the country. Tennessee is still an issue. I think, you know, that's really dragged on. The situation in New York, it's mellowed, but it could flare up again, simply because even the person who was behind it has changed the design, you know, and sort of, you know, backed off. But the temperament there is still very, very strong. I mean, if you want to see it, you know, I don't know why you can say this, but go up and Google me. Okay? And you'll go up and you'll see on Google that, unless Google's lying on a certain day, you'll see about 2 million hits, okay? And you'll see the good, the bad, and the really ugly. And when you see that mentality and the way some people talk, that will be your answer. We have an organized network of preachers of hate. And I don't use preachers in a narrow religious sense here. I don't mean necessarily just religious leaders, okay? Preachers of hate. And they exacerbate the situation. And some of these people travel all over the country. They get incredible amounts of support and money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's what keeps a lot of this alive. But in some communities, yes, particularly where there's a tragedy. And we have some really great situations. There was one in Oklahoma where the community came out of all different faiths, you know, to rally around people who were having, who had been, been attacked. But in other situations, people can be incredibly ugly. Yeah.
I've been curious about the conversion rate of Islam and like how many converts come to Islam, how does that compare to other religions?
That I don't know. You have a significant conversion rate in many countries. I think would stymie some people. I mean, people like us, that is, in Western context, often what they're surprised at is it's not just, a lot of it can be in a marriage, but also, I've seen this in Europe, for example, you get headlines every now and then which basically say, in effect, oh my God, some of the best and the brightest in our society, good white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in background, maybe Oxford graduates, are becoming Muslims. And we see that also here, because it's easier for us to deal with converts, who are, I don't know what, basketball players. Catholics went through this. When Luce, the wife of Henry Roosevelt. Yeah, when Claire Booth became a Catholic, we celebrated that. When any prominent intellectual became a Catholic. Then we celebrated when singers like Johnny Mathis became a Catholic. Or we celebrated when, and when I would go out to speak in the 70s and 80s, I'd get messages. I'd be speaking and somebody at the embassy would say, there's a rumor out there that Neil Armstrong found God and found Islam on the moon. You've got to be ready that Muslims are going to go for it. That great sort of pride, But what we do see is that the conversion rates can be very diverse. They can be the head of the ROTC at Holy Cross, who was Mr. Tough. And so I get to know him, and he's a Muslim. And I asked him why he converted. He was in Thailand, he was walking down a road, he heard the recitation of the Quran, it drew him to the mosque, the rest became history. They can be a guy I know named Alex Cronemer, who now produces with his with a friend of his who is also a convert, produces terrific films on Muslims, on Muslim history that are on PBS. Alex Cronemer was a graduate of Harvard Divinity School and a Christian, converted to Islam. And they can be people who come to the religion, whether educated or not, because they marry a spouse. Okay, thanks for being so patient.